Well, before I begin the lesson tonight, let me just mention a few things. I actually wanted to give some of these things to John so he could mention them at the close of the service, but since I'm up here and since I did not do that, I want to mention these. We want to congratulate Mike and Michelle. They are the new grandparents for the 7th time. They have a granddaughter named Hattie Tatum, I believe is her name, and we're grateful for that. All's going well. We continue to remember Mel and Laura Ambrose, and as they're in Arizona hoping to give another child a home. Rachel and JT get married toward the end of the week, and I know you have already been praying for them, and so we want to keep them in our prayers. Ben and Laura have a new address, and we'll get that out to you. There are new directories that are available in the usual location, and a new Lord's Supper sign-up sheet for the coming year is available. I think I did that pretty quick. That's a lot of stuff. So I wanted to get all those things to you, and I just thought I would do that before I began the lesson tonight. You know, these are things that we bring up. Sometimes we put them out electronically. Sometimes we need to say these things in a public assembly like this, maybe so that word will get out. But don't take those things for granted. The reason that we want to say those things is so that people will know and we communicate. It's important for all of us to do that. So I hope that you will understand that, and I know that you do. You know, Beth and I we travel quite a bit. I would typically, when we lived in Florida, I flew a lot of places. I don't fly as much anymore because by the time I get to an airport now and fly to where I need to go, I can pretty much be there. And it just makes it convenient to have a vehicle when I'm there. And one of the things that I like doing when I drive is I like traveling from state to state. And just seeing the different places and all of that. And I've been every place, I think, in the U.S. Hadn't been to Hawaii, but if any of y'all want to take me sometime, I'd be glad to go with you just to see it so I could cover that base. But when we do travel, I enjoy going from state to state. I like going across state lines. I like seeing the signs, the welcome signs. I like, because typically they have the motto of the state. They probably have the governor's name, and that's usually what most of them have. And what I'm reminded of when I go into another state is that I have come out of a particular state. And all that reminds me of really is that there are a lot of boundaries. And state boundaries are one of those kinds of things on a smaller scale. Of course, there are counties and there are towns. There's personal property boundaries. I mean, I have property where my home sits, and if you come to my house and I don't give you permission, you trespass and you run a risk of me calling the law. But because there's some boundaries that everybody wants to be aware of if you come to different people's homes. We have, interesting to me, we have airspace. You know, countries now have airspace, and if you're in our airspace or if you're in our territorial waters, we're big on where we draw the line, so to speak. And so we all want our area. We want all our collective area. We want our individual area, you know. I know you're not going to agree with this, but, you know, you have your pew, don't you? You not only have your pew, you have your seat in your pew. And if I had my way, I'd move everybody. But I don't have my way, so you're going to sit in your pew where your seat is most all the time. Because that's what you do. That's where you are. And there may be good reasons for all that. I'm kind of playing with you when I say that. But we all are territorial when it comes to that. So boundaries can be described, I think, in a lot of different ways, by a lot of different words. We sometimes talk about something that's open and something that's closed. Well, those are boundaries, if you will. We talk about things that have a beginning and things that have an end. We talk about something rising. We talk about something falling. We talk about certain things starting, certain things stopping. We talk about somebody being born, somebody dying. All those have to do, in a sense, with what I want to talk to you about tonight. And they have to do with boundaries. You could think of multiple other things that I haven't thought about tonight, but we live in a boundary-related time continuum. Actually, time itself is bound. You know, time began and time will end. I think that's an interesting thing, and that's kind of the hitch, I think, that I want to grab hold of tonight when we think about this. But think about this. No one lives outside of boundaries, you ready for this? Except the one who lives outside of boundaries. There's only one who does that. You ever thought about that? There's only one who lives outside of what boundaries are, outside of what limits are, and that obviously that person is God. And I think we need to think about God in this way, and that's a hard thing to do. And it's hard for us to think outside of time because that's where we live, and everything relates to that in our lives. So when we talk about God being eternal and God living outside of time, we can spell the word. And I think if I ask you to define eternity, you would try, but I'm not sure you could. I'm pretty sure you couldn't define it the way God defines it. I'm sure I can't define it, not the way God defines it. I think we have an idea, and I think the point sometimes is well made. We don't talk about time, or rather, we don't talk about eternity in terms really of quantity. It's not quantified as much as it is qualified. It has to do with the quality as to the quantity. And I think that's really a better way. As I think about eternity, I'm thinking about God and all the ways that He is not bound. And when I am with Him, I will be living in eternity, not bound by some of the things that I'm even bound by now. I will be, the Bible tells us that we'll be like Him. I don't think we're ever going to be God, but He's going to give us a new body, and He's going to give us things that hopefully that will change the way that we are. And so I think that helps us at least think about God. Turn over to the Gospel of John. We're going to look at some things in John. We're going to look at some things in Revelation, and then eventually we're going to go to the book of Isaiah to look at some things as we consider this idea. John 1:1, we're very familiar with this verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, we're told later on in John 1 that the Word is Jesus Christ. Jesus became flesh. We're told about that. So when you get to John 8, I want you to turn over there and look at that passage. These are some concepts, and the language I think helps us get a better idea. I say a better idea. It just gives us another idea of what Jesus and God are trying to help us understand when they try to help us understand their very nature, okay? This is John 8. This is verse 58. Jesus is having a conversation with the Jews who are saying that they have Abraham as their father, and then Jesus tries to help them understand who He really is. Verse 58, Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." That has to do with quality. I am tells you He's not limited. He is eternal. The very fact that He says, I am, tells you we're not talking about a beginning and an end. We're talking about something that was hard for them to understand, and it's hard for us to understand. I know it's hard for them because verse 59 says this, "Then they took up stones to throw at Him, but Jesus hid Himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by." I've thought about verse 59 an awful lot. Listen to it. They took up stones to throw at Him, but Jesus hid Himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. Can you do that? He's in the temple. They're all talking to Him, and the text tells us that He hid Himself. Now, I'm telling you, He hid Himself, and He went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. He didn't do that unless, in my judgment, He didn't do that except He's God. And it wasn't time for Him to die. He did some things that none of us can do. And I think even by verse 59, I think He's showing, in a very real sense, what He said about Himself in verse 58. He said, I am. And while the text doesn't tell us this, I think verse 59 just proves His point to them. that he says, I have always been. And I can do things in which I'm not limited like you. Now, I haven't done all the research to go back and look at all of those words, but the indication that I've been able to find is that there was something about him moving out of that environment at that time that was miraculous. There would have been a lot of people there. But he hid himself by going out of the temple. This same writer that wrote the Gospel of John wrote the book that in our English Bibles is the last book, the book of Revelation. I want you to turn to Revelation 22. There are statements that are made, not just by John, but we're going to look at a few by John that have something to do with John not only saying in John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And later on we find out that he's referring to Jesus. But at the end, he would also say in verse 12, Jesus himself of Revelation 22 would say, and behold, I am coming quickly, and my reward is with me to give to everyone according to his work. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. In other words, what Jesus said is, I'm not bound. I'm not limited. I'm not limited by space. I'm not limited by time. I am who I am. I'm not limited by any boundaries. Nothing can stop me, in essence. In Revelation 1, go back to the beginning of this same letter. I'm just looking at several passages that help us, I think, understand John's use of this point. This is the same idea in Revelation 1 in verse 4. John to the 7 churches which are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness. I think all he's saying here is he is helping these churches obviously understand that he is not limited. He's not limited by time and space. And again, we read those words, but I think it's hard for us to truly understand what he's saying. Who is and who was and who is to come. I think that language helps us understand something about Jesus himself. So, let's go back to Revelation 21. I've got this down in my notes as well. We may as well look at that because I think it is important. Revelation 21. Remember verses 2 and 3. Let's just read this. This is really John saying what he saw and that all things are going to be made new. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. He will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. And all I'm simply saying in that is that whatever God is, and this New Jerusalem as he's talking about here, which I personally think has to do with heaven and the things in that realm, he's really simply saying that God is making all things new. There are no longer going to be any more boundaries. So what does Alpha, I am the Alpha and I am the Omega mean? You know, we read that and I think when we read that we just simply think, well, he's the beginning and the end. And that is, Alpha is the first letter in the Greek alphabet, Omega is the last letter. It would be the same as me saying, well, you know, he goes from A to Z. If I'm talking about the English language, it goes from A to Z. What you're really saying is that this has to do with completeness. And that's what I think Jesus himself is trying to say. It carries the idea of completeness. Now, I want you to look at a couple other things. Go turn to the Old Testament book of Isaiah. This is the Alpha and Omega idea is not carried with it as well, but there is another phrase that is carried with it that has to do with first and last. And it really means something of the same thing. And I want you, here's why we're talking about this tonight. I just want you to be impressed with language that we commonly hear. I think all of us, myself included, sometimes we read things and we don't really think about those things. We just say he's the Alpha, he's Omega, he's the beginning and he's the first and the last. And yet we don't really stop and think, why would he use that kind of language? And I think, if nothing else tonight, I think it helps us understand that. I want you to look at three places. Turn over to Isaiah 41. I'm going to just have you bounce around to a couple of passages here in Isaiah, about three passages. Look at Isaiah 41 and verse 4. Who has performed and done it, calling the generations from the beginning. I, the Lord, am the first, and with the last I am He. Simply referring to the fact that God is in control, in essence, of all the nations and all the things that the nations do. Now, we know that intellectually, but I think sometimes practically we think, well, nations do what nations do because nations they choose to do those things. I'm not disagreeing with that, but I'm telling you, nations may do what they do, but God uses whatever it is that they do to accomplish His purposes. You can be assured of that. And what He's saying here, I think in Isaiah 41, He's reassuring them, listen, I'm in control. Whatever they do, don't you doubt what they're doing. And these people to whom Isaiah is writing, obviously were people who, if they hadn't already been in captivity, they would go into captivity. So He's helping them understand, whatever happens to you, I'm always in control. And I think that's a good lesson for us to learn as well. God controls nations in the purest sense. I'm not suggesting that He causes everything to happen like it does. They make their own decisions. Individuals make decisions for nations, just like in our country, individuals make decisions for nations. But God is ultimately in control of that. And He uses this first and last language, I think, to help us understand that. Turn over to the 44th chapter of the book of Isaiah. Look at Isaiah 44. Verses 6 and 7. Thus says the Lord, the King of Israel, and His Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first, and I am the last. Besides me there is no God. And who can proclaim as I do? Let him declare it and set it in order for me. Since I appointed the ancient people and the things that are coming and shall come, let them show these to them. Well, I think the meaning here is when He says, I'm the first and the last, I think He's simply saying that God has the unique ability to know the future. He's not like an idol. Again, I think for us to put ourselves, as much as we can, to put ourselves in the time of Isaiah, that idol worship was very prominent. Matter of fact, we're going to look at it. Turn over to Isaiah 40, and we're going to read some passages from Isaiah 40 that help us understand that. But the meaning here is that God has the ability to know the future, and He says an idol can't do that. It's I who can do that, and I am not like an idol. I want you to turn, I know you're already there, but look beginning in look at verse 12 of Isaiah 40. Now, like this morning, I'm going to read a little bit. And I want you to follow, but I want you to see, when we finish this reading, I want you to ask yourself, is there any doubt of who God is and that He is the first and the last? Is there any doubt as to how He wants us to understand Him? I love this language, and that's probably not the right thing to say, but I think it helps us understand who He is. Think about God saying this. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of His hand? Measured heaven with a span and calculated the dust of the earth in a measure? Weighed the mountain in scales and the hills in a balance? Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as His counselor has taught Him? With whom did He take counsel, and who instructed Him and taught Him in the path of justice? Who taught Him knowledge and showed Him the way of understanding? Behold, the nations are as a drop in a bucket, and are counted as the small dust on the scales. Look, He lifts up the isles as a very little thing, and Lebanon's not sufficient to burn, nor its beast sufficient for a burnt offering. All nations before him are as nothing. They are counted by him less than nothing and worthless. To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness will you compare to him? The workman molds an image, the goldsmith overspreads it with gold, and the silversmith casts silver change. Whoever is too impoverished for such a contribution chooses a tree that will not rot. He seeks for himself a skillful workman to prepare a carved image that will not totter. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is He who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. He brings the princes to nothing. He makes the judges of the earth useless. Scarcely shall they be planted, scarcely shall they be sown, scarcely shall their stock take root in the earth. When He will also blow on them, and they will wither, and the whirlwind will take them away like stubble. To whom then will you liken me? Or to whom shall I be equal, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these things. Who brings out their hosts by number. He calls them all by name. By the greatness of His might and the strength of His power, not one is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel? My way is hidden from the Lord, and my just claim is passed over by my God. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the Creator of the ends of the earth, neither faints nor is weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the weak, and to those who have no might He increases strength. Even the youths shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fail. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Everything in that just speaks volumes about Him being the first and the last. Everything in there speaks volumes about Him being the Alpha and the Omega. Everything in there speaks to the fact that I'm not limited, referring to God. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of His hand? If you want to know what that means, go out and stand on the seashore and look out over the sea or look out over the ocean and put out your hand and then tell yourself, God measures all the waters in the hollow of His hand. Our minds say that's how big He is. Our minds say that because that's all our minds can think about. That's why He said it the way He said it. Because we understand that comparison, but not really. Not really. So again, I think what He's trying to do is simply tell us that He is so much bigger, so much more powerful. He is the Alpha, He is the Omega, He is the beginning, He is the end, He is the first and He is the last. And He wants us to appreciate Him for who He is. And I think why Isaiah uses these figures and these statements are because he wants the people to whom he writes, and God wants those people to whom He writes to know that their story's not finished. You ever thought about God raising up those prophets and going to them and preaching what God wanted to preach? And really, if their situation was hopeless, what's the point of him going to them? What's the point of the prophet going to them? I think the point of it is that he's saying to them, your story's not complete. You're dealing with somebody who is the beginning and the end, who is the first and the last, who is the Alpha and the Omega. And I think that helps them understand the fact that they need to continue to put their trust and their confidence in God. One New Testament passage. Turn your New Testaments over to Philippians 1, please. Philippians 1. Let's begin in verse 3. This is the prayer. This is one of the prayers that's found in this letter that Paul writes to Christians that he knew, but yet he himself is in a Roman prison. He said, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, making request for you with all joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. You get that idea? He that has begun a good work in you will complete it. You know, in our minds, we think he's talking about Christians who are going to complete their work when they die. I don't think that's what he's saying. I think what he's saying is God is going to complete his work in you ultimately when we're with him forever. We ourselves, we may not be the Alpha and the Omega, but we are going to be able to live in the environment, whatever that is. Even as I mentioned this morning, I don't know everything about that, but we're going to be able to live in an environment that tells us that we are with the Alpha and the Omega. See, those are terms that are just beyond our reach. And I don't doubt that God included those terms in his inspired record because they're terms that we can't understand. That they are terms that help us understand this is what he is. He is the Alpha and he is Omega, and he's everything beyond that. And when we're impressed with that, then I think it gives us the sense of awe that I think God wanted to render through Isaiah when he said what he said in Isaiah 40. Do you really understand who I am? This kind of thing, this kind of recognition about these phrases, first and last, Alpha and Omega, beginning and the end, I think those are phrases that we need to meditate on more. In our quiet moments, I think those are the kinds of things that we need to think about and to thank God that he has shared those thoughts with us, even though we don't understand them, not completely. But it gives us a better idea of actually who it is that we serve and who it is that one day we'll be with forever because he lives outside of time. I continue to be a little bit, maybe that's a little bit's not the right word, but I continue to be a lot of bit overwhelmed with eternity and eternal life and eternal condemnation. All those phrases, I try to grasp that as much as I can, but again, I think those are hard things for us to grasp. But that's what he tells us. And if we can insert in that God is and his Son is the Alpha and the Omega, they live outside of those bounds, and one day we have an opportunity to be with him forever, it just magnifies the great blessing that we have in Jesus Christ. So I hope that maybe when you read that term, I am the Alpha and I am the Omega, I am the first and I am the last, I hope you will and I will appreciate what God is trying to tell us about himself. That's my lesson for tonight. I appreciate so very much your listening to me as you always do. If you have a spiritual need that we can help you with, make that known by coming forward as we stand and as we sing.